So, just like in Second Life, there's a number of default primitives or shapes that we can start to work with. We can edit these a little differently from Second Life, but just for now, we're not. We're going to work with the actual primitives. So let's see what we got. We got the default cube, which we know. If I go to Mesh Add, down the bottom here, add a mesh. You probably won't have these down here. I'm not sure if this is a plugin I've got enabled or not, but don't worry about these for the moment. We're going to concern ourselves with the top of this list. So we can add a plane. A plane is just a flat surface. We've already added the cube. I'll use Shift A this time. We can add a circle. A circle has some extra options. If I just expand the toolbar here, under Add Circle, vertices is a number of points around a circle. We can adjust the radius. Fill type, we can add a triangle pan just to get a surface on it. Don't worry too much about the rest of it for now. Let's move this out of the way. And just like I said, we can grab the arrows and drag and move and manipulate. Okay. Shift A again. What we got after circle? We got a UV sphere. Again, when adding all of these objects, or most of them, you've got a number of options you can use, but don't worry too much about them now. I'm going to move this out of the way. We have an icosphere, which is a different kind of sphere. UV sphere will use squares or quads, as we call them in 3D, to form the shape. The icosphere uses triangles, and each triangle is precisely the same size as the other, whereas if you look at the UV sphere, the quads vary in size. Most of the time when you're using spheres, you will be using the UV sphere. Shift A, we've got a cylinder. Again, we've got options for sizes from radius. So let's move this out of the way. And Shift A again. We've got a cone, which is, well, exactly what it says it is, it's a cone. Again, there's options. One thing I should note though is once you, let me delete this cone for a minute. Once you res or create, and the options there, the second you do anything to this object, these options are gone, they're lost. So as soon as I move it, it's gone. Okay, and I think we have left a torus, and we can move it. We did have the options there again. Okay, we can resize these objects, and we call that scaling. So let's work with this torus. I just use the period key on my numpad to center my focus on the selected object. So for example, if I selected the cube with a right click and I used the period key, it'll center my camera or my view onto that object. But let's go back to the torus. Okay, we can scale, resize this object. We can scale it, and we do that with the S key. So if I press S, you'll see we have a little double arrow, and as I move my mouse in and out, it rescales the object. I'm just going to right click to cancel that action. Okay, and I'm going to do it again, but this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my cursor very close to the center of the object, to the origin, the little orange dot there. If I press S, you see it takes very, very little mouse movement to move this a lot, and this can be rather frustrating really, because you're trying to accurately scale an object and you can't. But however, if you hold your mouse further away from the object, and I press S again, I've got much more control over how to resize. Okay, now if I only wanted to resize in one direction, say I wanted to make it bigger in the X direction, following the red arrow, I would press S, then followed by X. You will see that the red line appears through the object, and now it will only resize on that axis. Okay, if I wanted to resize on two axes, what I would do is I would disable the third axis. So say I wanted to resize it on both X and Y but not Z, I would press S for scale, and then I would press Shift and Z or Z together, and that will constrain it to just the X and Y axis. So Shift you can think of as a not, so Shift Z would be not Z. I can do that again with S and Shift Y, for example. So it'll constrain it to the X and the Z axes. Okay. Another way we can move objects around is by grabbing them and just moving them. And we do that with the G key, G for grab. So if I just press G, the object follows my cursor around. Now here you have to be a little careful, because we're looking at a three-dimensional scene on a two-dimensional screen, so we don't have many references as to where in space this object actually is. Okay, but what we can do is we can go into a plan view by using the numpad keys. So if I press numpad 1, for example, it'll go into a front view. Numpad 3 will go into a right view, and numpad 7 will go into a top view. Okay, but we're in what's called perspective here. Okay, so we're not getting a true drawing type, looking straight on it, not a true plan. We can toggle between perspective and orthographic views using the numpad 5 key. So if I press numpad 5, you see this is looking more like it would as you would draw it on plan paper. Now I know exactly where in 3D space I'm moving it, because I've disabled the view from the Y plane, the Y direction. Okay, so now if I press G, I know that this object is always going to be in the same space in Y, and it's only going to move on the X and the Z or the Z. So I can move that around. If I wanted to move it on the Y, I would change my view to say the top view with the numpad 7. Now if I press G, it's going to be in the same space in Z, it's going to be the same height as it's always been, and just move on the X and Y. Okay, so and when you orbit out, okay, it doesn't change back to a perspective view, it remains an ortho, so you've got to keep an eye on what's going on up here, in which type of view you're in, orthographic or perspective, and you just toggle them using the 5 key on the numpad. Okay. We also have another object that we can use in Blender, and if I use Shift A, mesh, and come down, we've got monkey. So this monkey has a name. She's called Suzanne. Don't ask me why she's called Suzanne, she just is. She always has been in Blender, she always probably will be. Most 3D programs will use a teapot as a default test object. Blender, being typically different, uses Suzanne. Okay, we will be using Suzanne quite a bit in the early lessons to demonstrate functions and ways to do things. So you will see quite a bit of her. And once again, we can move her about as we wish. GX, GY, GZ. Okay, so that's moving objects and scaling objects. So if we were to scale or resize Suzanne, I'd use the S key. Okay. The other thing we can do is rotate objects, and we use that using the R key, R for rotate. So for example, I've got Suzanne here. If I press R, I can rotate her around. Okay. Same thing applies. If I only want to rotate her on one axis, say the X-axis, I would press R and X, and she will only rotate on the X. R and Y, R and Z or Z. So we know how to scale, we know how to position, and we know how to rotate. These are pretty much very similar to Second Life, and it gives us good practice in learning how to move things and manipulate our way around the 3D space. Okay, so for an extra project this week, what I want you to do is, using Suzanne, is to make something very simple scene. You can think of it like Prim building. We'll get into editing meshes next week, but this week I just want you to get used to moving around in the space and introducing objects into the scene and manipulating them. So using Suzanne, I want you to build something using any of the other primitive types, or a combination of them, just to kind of get the feel and show off a bit of your creativity even. For example, I quickly just made a jack-in-a-box type thing with Suzanne. Okay, and if we can spend possibly half an hour during the week just practicing this, doing this, getting a feel for Blender, getting a feel for moving around in 3D space, we'll be all set next week to start making our first meshes.